Incoming transmission now.
Hey, welcome to Voided Transmissions. I am your host, Jason Brazier, and I am very, very, very excited to have my first guest on the podcast is David J. Fielding, and known to many 90s kids as the original Zordon on Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. David, how are you doing?
I am doing okay. I am doing all right.
Well, good, good. And we've known each other for a few years now. We worked on a web series a few years ago called Strange Happenings.
Very fun. Yeah, very fun web series. Yeah,
that was a lot of fun. We brought you to Springfield, Missouri, and that was I think that was the first time we met and worked together. And and we kept up with each other during the pandemic a little bit because there was a lot going on there, obviously. But what have you been up to since?
I have been traveling to conventions and writing a lot. I've finished 3 books in the last 4 years, 4.5 years. So a lot of writing, a lot of a lot of tweeting, a lot of just sort of like trying to deal with the kind of very dull and boring dystopia that we all kind of find ourselves in these days. So,
well, that's good. How has the convention scene been since post pandemic?
Well, I mean, it's starting to pick up. Whenever I go to one, it's always people are always so glad to be out and about and to doing some of the things that they were used to doing for a long time. So, Kansas. I was in Michigan and where else? There were a couple of them earlier in the spring that were just hopping. There were a lot of people there, and then was in Salt Lake in September. Was in Fan Expo in Dallas earlier in the summer. And getting ready to do 2 in a row here, going out to Abilene this weekend and then Midland, Texas the weekend after. So people are just happy to be out and to, indulge in their geek and nerd culture and stuff. It's very cool.
Well, good. Yeah, I can't wait to get out to a convention again myself here sometime soon. I haven't had a chance to, but that's good. I'm glad people are enjoying it. And I see a lot of people posting photos and all of that. And speaking of conventions, when I think it was after we were done filming one day on Strange Happenings, you told a story to us, and it was kind of a memorable story for you. It was before the convention opened, and there was a guy walking around. Do you recall that story?
I don't.
You don't? Okay, all right, that's fine. Well, we were sitting there, and I remember it really hit you hard. I can't remember what it was about. He kept looking over at you. Man, that's been. If I could remember the story, that would help me. But I remember you telling us the story, and it had a major impact on you with how Zordon.
Really helped. I mean, a lot of interactions with fans always have an impact because you never really know how you touch people. And that has nothing to do with being a celebrity. It has nothing to do with being on a popular TV show or anything like that. It has to do with just basic human interaction. And I'm pretty sure the story I told you was about me feeling very humbled that this person saw me as larger than life or whatever. And
I think it was yes, it was something about how he grew up in a really bad part of a city, and he was always getting bullied, and the Power Rangers and Zordon always kind of were his thing to go to and helped him kind of survive middle school and all that. I remember that just came back to me. But
Power Rangers was a touchstone for a lot of people that had instances or extended periods where they were picked on or bullied, and the show dealt with that kind of like on an episode by episode basis. We had the Bulk and Skull characters who started off as like these
Yep.
goofy little bully guys, and then Paul and Jason are terrific guys, the actors that play those characters, and Power Rangers wouldn't be Power Rangers without Bulk and Skull, and Bulk and Skull really are, for me at least, they're the heart of the show. They show you, how you can start off one way and end up, being much more heroic at the end, and I think they have such a great character arc in the show. But
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
their fans the world over have told us stories, or we hear it a lot about how you guys were there for me when nobody else was. So I mean, it's very humbling, and I'm always very grateful when I hear stuff like that, because we always like to think that how can I have an impact on the world. And I know I beat myself up a lot, thinking that I'm not doing enough. But then every now and then I'll have a conversation with somebody that reminds me that, oh yeah, I still am making a difference, which is great. So.
Well, good. Well, speaking of Power, I mean, because I grew up watching it, and I mean that was like, as soon as school got over, I could tell you my exact routine. My brother and I would get home, we would make our after school snack. My choice after school snack was burritos with salsa and a glass of Dr. Pepper. Go sit down in Dad's chair, turn on the TV, and right around, I think it was 4:00 or 4:30 is when Power Rangers would come on. And that was just, that's just what I did. Even through high school, I would turn stuff on like that on because they had reruns, just because it was nostalgic, and it helped me a lot too as a kid.
Sure.
But, and then years later, here I am, got to work with you, and I've met a few of the Rangers myself. But how did you get the role of Zordon?
I got the role of Zordon through a college friend. I had done my undergraduate theater work at Southwest Texas State University, which is now just Texas University in San Marcos, Texas. And I had a large group of friends that I did a bunch of theater work with there. And when I went to the East Coast, to the University of Pittsburgh to get my master's degree, a bunch of those folks went out to California. And when I went out to California 3 years later, I had sort of like this network of friends that were already out there that could kind of show me around, and we would hang out and do that kind of stuff. And Stacy was working at Saban at the time as part of as a production assistant or a second AD on some of the films that they were doing straight to video back in those days. And I hadn't been in LA for more than 2 months when she called me and asked me if I wanted to audition for a role that they were holding for a kids television pilot that they were producing. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's, and I said, sure, that's why I went to LA, to see if I could do anything in the movies or TV or whatever. And I went down to the building and was expecting to be one of 15,000 guys who was waiting in line to put themselves on tape, and then I would go home and never hear anything. That's kind of like the standard routine that you get when you go for these auditions and stuff. And I was very surprised to learn when I got down there, it was just me and another guy. And they were going to cast it that night, and they wanted to know if we were both available for filming the following week. And I, can remember thinking to myself, this is really highly unusual. This is not how this works. And so I just, relied on my training. And, whenever people tell you stories about how they get parts or how they landed a role or whatever, they always talk about how there's an element of luck or being in the right place at the right time. I think there's also an element of being prepared for it. Being prepared for those moments of luck, being prepared for those moments of right place, right time, because I had so much training, because I'd had this I'd been building up to that kind of moment. And so I was ready to go when it happened. And fortunately, I had the quality and the vocal tone that they were looking for the character, and that's why I got the part. So,
And correct me if I'm wrong. Did they how much did they film you?
we filmed one time, and I think I was in the chair for about 4.5 hours, just while they were adjusting lights, and we went over the script a few times. Because all of the lines that we recorded in that filming session were for the pilot, which they reshot once the series got picked up, and I had to go into the ADR studio to re-record some of the lines for vocal adjustment or whatever. But though that was the only time the character was ever filmed, and much like the Japanese footage that they recycled from the original Sentai, Zordon was recycled from episode to episode. So they continued to use my face throughout the life of the character until Andros shattered the power chamber in Countdown Destruction Part 2. But I stopped recording the voice of Zordon after episode 31. I was burnt out by LA at that time. I was working 2 jobs, afraid I was going to be living under a bridge from week to week, and really wasn't doing what I had gone out there to do. Was very sort of unhappy, so I left. But it was very interesting to sort of land in LA, and within 2 months did something that people had been there, other people had been in that city for 20 years and never got that kind of chance. So, I mean, it was very sort of fortuitous that it happened.
Yeah, and then that is highly unusual, and I think just the entire making of that show was kind of highly unusual in how everybody came to be.
Well, what's interesting about it is Haim had been trying to pitch that show for years. He was on some sort of trip to Japan in the mid 80s or early 80s, and he had seen the Sentai shows on television over there. And was really sort of hyped up about bringing it over to the States. And they even filmed a prototype version of Power Rangers in the 80s with Mark Dacascos as one of the main characters, but it didn't
really.
It didn't go anywhere, and none of the studios could get behind him. But when he was pitching this version of the show, and this is all in if you watch The Toys That Made Us on Netflix, they talk about how all of this stuff about how the woman who was at Fox Kids at that time, she got it, she understood, and she saw the appeal, and that's what really sort of jump started the whole thing. I mean, plus the fact that I think the element that really makes Power Rangers stand apart from any of these other shows that are really popular, like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and He-Man and all that kind of stuff, like those shows, if you got into those shows, you had to wait 6, 8, 9 months for those toys to show up on the shelves so you could recreate them. But the day that the show aired, those toys were already on the shelves, so the kids could play with them on the same day that the show was airing, and just and so it just shot that show right into the stratosphere at that point. That and Ron Wasserman's music is just so iconic. You hear that theme and you know exactly what it is. And
it was different for a kids show, because I mean it was like heavy metal.
Yeah, it was rock and roll. It was lightning fast. It was action, kids flipping, kicking, punching, and bright colors and big rubber monsters. It was freaking awesome.
Yeah, and then of course made kids like me jump all over the living room, and my brother and I accidentally hurting each other thinking we knew how to do karate. And
I mean, when I was told what the show was and how they were putting together, I got it right away, because I grew up watching Ultraman and Spectre-Man and Battle of the Planets, and I was like, okay, that makes perfect sense. And so but again, at the time when I did it, it was still considered sort of like this Saturday morning or weekday afternoon kind of kids show. And in my experience, those shows they were always in constant rotation. Those shows would last a year, and then they would get replaced by whatever the newest thing was. So nobody at that time had any sort of like, or at least I didn't have any sort of indication that it was going to go any further than that. And this was before the internet. This was before social media and the pop culture explosion. And yeah, so I mean, it was just sort of like, for a long time for me, it was just a cute little anecdote that I could tell people at parties. Oh yeah, I was on this kid's TV show. And it wasn't until, Facebook came around that I started to sort of like find myself having to catch up, because I was like, holy shit, this show is still going on. Wow, that's interesting.
Well, yeah, it's crazy too, because I even remember, because I remember when the toys came out, because by God, I wanted those toys, and I still have. I've collected some over the years, especially the ones that I was not able to get as a kid. But I think that was a very smart move. It's kind of like when you look at how Saban did the show, it was kind of like what George Lucas did with Star Wars, but almost from a Roger Corman standpoint, where he was doing it on the cheap, if you will. I don't know if that's the best way to put it.
It's interesting that you say that, because I just saw a clip the other day from a Wes Anderson film that came out not too long ago. Is a film with Ralph Fiennes and
Grand Budapest Hotel?
Yeah. There's a shot where he's on a train, and the train's supposed to pull to a stop, and he sees this like armed force off, they're going to arrest him. But when you look at how they shot that,
it's a little box, isn't it?
Yeah, it wasn't a train at all. And it's like, oh, so even if you have like this big budget movie that you're doing, they're still going to do things on the cheap. They're going to do it. That is,
it's all an illusion. That's
exactly.
One of my favorite films that I watch it every Halloween, and even just whenever, but is Bram Stoker's Dracula that Francis Ford Coppola did.
Oh yeah,
because all the effects in that movie are done in camera. There's no CGI in that film. They did
Right.
all old school tricks, and
it's all practical stuff.
Yeah, and stuff that people don't do anymore. I'm just like, just like on Strange Happenings, we tried to do everything more practical because it just looks better. I feel like too personally, and there's just a magic to it.
Yeah, I think it makes you a more creative filmmaker, because you're forced to solve problems in a way, like like the way Sam Raimi used the camera in the Evil Dead films. It's like this is going to be. I mean, it was a very emotional thing for people who are watching it, whether or not they acknowledge that it affected them emotionally. But when the camera moves that way, you're going to feel something one way or the other. And but yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I mean, do it, solve the problem, do something interesting with the camera,
Yeah, well, here's the thing. It wasn't until years later that, and as a kid when it came out, I mean, I was like right at that perfect age of like 7 or 8. And I didn't realize until I was much older about the Sentai footage, because I started looking at I think it was the thing that got me was the Green Ranger and the vest that he had on, or that armor, and how Tommy's looked completely different from what was in the Sentai one. But as a kid, I didn't notice that. I didn't care. And then I was just like watching it going, man, I was either really dense, or I just didn't. I mean, as a kid, I didn't care. That's also a thing too. And there's some great footage too. I don't know if you've seen this online on YouTube, but like of how they filmed the opening sequence of all the Zords, and how they did all that. That was all practical and old school with I was just like, that's just cool. I just love that stuff, and how the old style of filmmaking. But,
I think that's one of the reasons why I know a lot of people have a great deal of fondness for the 1995 Power Rangers movie. But the way they did the Zords and the CGI in that it's just bad.
Yeah. No.
I wish they had done more like what the TV show had. Because those designs of those robots and stuff were so much cooler than what they did with that movie.
The CG. No, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I mean, even as a kid, I love that movie, but even I was watching it as a kid, a teen or whatever, and I was going, really? The CG, of course, at that time, we were probably thinking CG was just where it was at. But of course, it's like a video game. You go look at a video game from 25 years ago, and you're like, man,
Well,
I thought that was cutting edge too.
Jurassic Park came out 2 years before that, and the CGI in Jurassic Park is light years ahead of what they did on that movie. So,
And you know what? That's fair. That's fair.
I mean, it just shows you. I mean, they didn't want to spend a great deal of
money. Yeah, the shoestring.
on it,
Shoestring. Yeah, the shoestring budget. And well, let's swing back to you talking about you've been focusing more on writing. So what have you been? What are some of the books that you've been focusing on?
For the last 4.5, 5 years, I've been working on a series of books in the supernatural paranormal realm. The series is subtitled The Lincoln Bright novels. The main character of the first book is Lincoln Bright. He is a young, or he's not young, he's like in his 30s, who, in the parlance of the books, he's an attuned. He can see and hear things that other people can't. He also has a sort of phantom partner that's tied to him that helps him find these things. Because and when I started the book, I wanted to write a ghost story, and but I didn't want to use the word ghost. I didn't want to use terms that people were used to as far as like ghost stories were concerned. And as a writer, and I'm sure you understand this, if you want people to get excited about something, you have to have a hook. You have to have a way to tell them a familiar story, but it seems a little bit new. There's something different about it. So that's where I came up with the idea that there aren't ghosts in Lincoln's world. There's what he calls glims. And glims are the leftover nastiness that people who have passed on might leave behind, of unresolved issues or problems or emotions or whatever. An entity is left behind after they pass on, and it doesn't happen all that often. And what I think in the book, it talks about how once in 100,000 or something like that. And normally these glims won't stick around long. But if they do stick around long enough, they'll start to eat away at the fabric of reality, and they'll pick apart, they'll pick a hole in the wall that leads to a different dimension where these other very hungry entities live, which Lincoln calls the dead. And if the dead get through into our plane, then all sorts of murders, mayhem happens. And so Lincoln travels about the country trying to find these glims that have stuck around and to eliminate them and the gaunt that they create, and to fight against the dead. He's also dealing with a group of apocalyptic magicians called the Hermetics, who are trying to get more of these glims to stick around so that they can bring about this sort of
apocalypse.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Were you working on this when we were doing Strange Happenings?
I had, I think so. I had written the first Lincoln Bright story in 2013. So I think.
Okay, yeah, you would. That's awesome.
Yeah. So and in the first book, Lincoln meets a young autistic boy by the name of Petey, who he finds out is an attune as well. So not only is he racing against time, he's also having to protect this young attune and teach him, and to bring him along. So
that's awesome. Well, and where can people read these books at?
They can find them on Barnes & Noble, or they can find them on Amazon.com. They're under the Caffeine and Ink print. That's the publisher, Caffeine and Ink. It's an small independent publisher out of New York, New Jersey. And I used to have links on my my Twitter page, but since Twitter maybe we don't know. But they're out there.
Okay, and do they just if they go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble, do they just need to type in Lincoln Bright novels?
Well, they can type in my name and Lincoln Bright, or the names of the novels. The first novel is called Glims. The second one is called Gaunts. The third one is Gifts, and the fourth one will be called The Dead.
Awesome. Okay, that's awesome. go to Barnes and Noble and check that out. Let my brother know, because my brother's been doing a lot of writing as well. So when we talk about story, and the power of storytelling,
Mhm.
when you do a lot of writing, do you find a catharsis in it, kind of or a catharsis or an escape as you're doing it?
Well, I mean, just as a sort of like tie-in to the Lincoln Bright stuff, when I wrote the first Lincoln Bright story, I knew I wanted to write a ghost story. And I was about 9,000 words into the story when it struck me, oh crap, I know what this story is all about. And I sent it over to a friend of mine and I said, would you read through this and tell me what you think it's all about? And he read through it and he goes, oh, I know exactly what this is. This is you dealing with your divorce. And I was like, it is. And so I thought that was very interesting, that my subconscious mind was trying to help me through the power of story to put to rest some feelings, unresolved junk that was left over. And that's really sort of, where the whole premise came from, of someone who, tries to help people by clearing all of this sort of unresolved junk that gets left behind. So, and again, it just talks about how, why we tell stories to one another, why we're always interested in not just entertaining one another, but helping each other, healing each other, that sort of thing. And to me, that's really the great power of words and stories that just continues to fascinate me all the time. So
Yeah, well, and I 100% agree, because during quarantine, I got back into writing poetry, and I even published a poetry book and self-published it. It's on Amazon, Gospel of Mankind. But it's kind of dark, so if you're not into dark poetry, I don't suggest it. But
well, see, that's the very interesting thing, because we've kind of giggled about calling it a dystopia, but I do think that our society is going through a very dark period, and I think it has a lot to do with social media. I think it has a lot to do with how fast information passes between people, and because we are living in an unprecedented time as far as when and how we hear about things. Because in the past, if the Lusitania sank in the ocean, people might not hear about that for months, weeks. It wasn't as lightning fast or instantaneously as it is today. I mean, if something happens around the world, about it 2 minutes later. And because we live in a world that has so many cameras, we have a camera in our hand, we have a computer in our hand, we have cameras on every corner, and all of that stuff is getting uploaded. And if you browse Reddit, or if you browse YouTube, if you browse Twitter, if you browse any social media, TikTok, whatever, you're going to see some things that you may not want to see, whether they're accidental or intentional. I've seen so many instances of horrific car crashes, or landslides, or explosions, people, dealing with fist fights and bar brawls, and it's just an avalanche of content that is, again, it's fighting for our attention. And yes, our brains are able to process 11 million sort of input things at a time, but we only sort of concentrate on maybe 40 or 60 of them at a time, or at least that's the information I read, or something like that. But we're still sort of pulling all that stuff in.
You're in it. It's like you're over inundated. It becomes very exhausting, and it's the same thing. Like, because I started writing this poetry, and then I started studying experimental film, because I had time now during quarantine, and I watched one of Guy Madden's films, and it inspired me to do a short film. And it's like I knew what I was writing about, but once I started putting it to film and seeing it and hearing the poem that I narrated and seeing it, I was like, man, I'm dealing with some past trauma, and
Yeah.
it was religious related. And then I just kept exploring that, and I went further down the rabbit hole, and I won't go to too much depth, but 2020 really, really, really,
Yeah, and I think that's part of it. I think
just screwed my mental health up, and I'm still recovering from it. I'm on a better path now, but if I hadn't done poetry and wrote these things out, and I kid you not, experimental film saved my life.
well, I don't think you're alone. I think there are so many people that are sort of opening up to what you're talking about as far as like, trauma and stuff. They're discovering, you know, it's all coming out. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, it's like there is a mental health crisis in the country now, and because I remember I made a short film and it's on my YouTube. It's called Oblivion. I can't watch it anymore because I probably made that film in my darkest moment, and I didn't know I was in my darkest moment at that time. But I just wrote a poem of how I was feeling, and then I picked up my camera and I just treated it like a paintbrush, and I just started filming how and describing what I was feeling. And I can't watch it anymore because it makes me cry.
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel like I perfectly encapsulated, for me at least, how anxiety and depression was making me feel. And in that moment, I never had any plan for this or any plans, but I came to a point, that I understood why some people committed suicide.
Mm-hmm.
And that film made me realize where I was, and I had to go to my wife, and I just said, I need help. And so and then when I tried to get a therapist, they were so backed up that I wasn't going to be, they had me on a 6-month waiting list. And I'm like, this is awful.
Yeah.
Because I know there are probably worse people out there worse off than where I was. And I was lucky enough that my wife helped me find a local therapist, and that lady, she helped me out amazingly. And I discovered a lot more about myself and what was bothering me, and I was working through things. But it opened my eyes to how people are, post pandemic, are dealing with things that they had, they were so busy beforehand, and then when life stopped, they had time to reflect on a lot of stuff, and they're trying to they were forced to face some things that they probably didn't want to. That's why they distracted themselves with work all the time, and and you're seeing all these people hurting, and people that you don't know that are hurting. And we won't go into too much depth on it, but like there's, just recently, Jason David Frank, one of my childhood heroes. And I met him about, 8 years ago at St. Louis Comic-Con. I stood in line for 4 hours to meet him and I was first in line. And my wife was just like, I'll sit with you. This guy was your hero growing up. You need to wait. And I waited, and it was worth it. And I got to talk with him and got his autograph, and he even has me on a video on his YouTube page still. And then, he even took an extra picture with my wife and me, and I still have that. And it's, and his autograph is right next to yours in my little collection. And, hearing what, that he was gone, it was just devastating, and there may have been other factors there, but I know that during Power Rangers, his brother, if I read correctly, if I could talk, that his brother committed suicide during the 90s. And so there may have been a history of mental health there that we don't know about. But it hurt me because, when you see your heroes growing up and that, and they were dealing with stuff and that you didn't know about, and we don't need to know about. It's everybody's, private life. But it really hits home that there's a bigger problem that we in America are having to deal with, and we're not getting the help that we need, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, I think that's a very sort of American thing, and maybe it's not just isolated to America, but I do think it is an American tradition to sweep things under the rug
Mm-hmm.
and uh, assume that an issue is taken care of, or that issue is ignored, and then we have to deal with it later on. And I think that's something that the country is uh, dealing with uh, on a level that's affecting, I think, everybody in the country. Um, just like what you were talking about, as far as like a mental health crisis, I think everybody is going through a mental health crisis of some kind or another, and when it gets to a point when it becomes very acute, uh, then you run into what you experienced of not being able to find somebody to help you with this because there's a 6-month backlog um, or whatnot, and all of us are impacted and are dealing with just life, and uh, you never really know what somebody is going through. I did not know Jason well. I wish I had. I wish there had been more of uh, a connection with Jason, because I know a lot of the fans will look at the show and think, well, you were Zordon. You and Tommy talked all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not the case. I mean, my face was on the show and Jason was cast after I was. So when he joined the show and went through the Green with Evil saga, which was just supposed to be the sort of like
One-off story.
yeah, it was supposed to be like an extended guest role for him, because there wasn't a whole lot of Green Ranger footage for them to use, because if you know the Zoo Ranger Sentai show, I mean, which is much darker than the American show. I mean, the Green Dragon Ranger is killed in that Sentai. So,
Mm-hmm.
which is, I think, one of the reasons why they had to bring in the White Ranger from a different series to continue to have footage for them to be fighting and stuff. And I mean, because TV shows and films are filmed in certain ways, and you're never really in the same room with anybody. I didn't get the on-set experience of making a TV show that I wanted when I moved out to LA, and so I never really got to know Jason. I never really got to interact with him, unlike some of my other castmates who they spent weeks and years together, going to lunch every day. And I see Johnny Young Bosch is extremely torn up about it, because they were close, and and because they were very competitive together. They were always pushing each other to do something more exciting, physically, testing the boundaries of what they could do with their martial arts skills and stuff. And that's very cool. But and I never was close enough that he could have reached out and talked or whatever, and not really showing, we never really know what anybody is going through. And I guess
Yeah, I think for me it just comes down to like the one thing I keep telling people is like, there's enough anger in the world that I don't want to add to it. And, I try to reach out and talk to as many people when they cross my mind, when they do, because I want them to know that I'm thinking of them. Because sometimes there's been people that have just contacted me and didn't know I was in a depressed mood just to say hi, and how much that lifted my spirits, and sometimes that's that's the first step in what you need. And um, it's a tough subject and it's hard, but like right now I think that you're right. This country is I think maybe, we all probably were dealing with this. And I think it is a very American thing. It's a very like 1950s ideal, if you think about it, because you've seen a lot of these people, politicians even still, and people who are political commentators that are out there right now asking, where are all the men? Where are the men gone? And, trying to like make fun of the fact that men are going to therapy and they shouldn't go to therapy. They need to bottle that up. And I'm like, no, that's toxic masculinity. That's the problem that
right. And
dealing with.
those kind of people are okay with sending guys off to die on the battlefield, but they don't want to help them when they get back.
Exactly.
And again, it's one of those things that, again, I think it's an American tradition or a part of the American fabric of always trying to sweep problems under the rug and not deal with them the way they should. I mean, we are still dealing with the fallout from the frickin' Civil War that happened 100 and how many years ago, because people came away from that bitter and angry, and passed that on to their children who continued to be bitter and angry, and that led to Jim Crow, that led to the civil rights movement, and it all the way up to George Floyd. I mean, it's still this unresolved, undealt with issue that our so-called quote unquote leaders are always trying to push to the side and say, we dealt with that already. Like, no, we haven't dealt with it at all.
It's always a band-aid, for political reasons, just to get votes. And
I think that that's sort of the attitude that happens in our educational system. It happens in our job areas. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've had a manager or a shift leader or something like that will be like, well, we'll put that aside and we'll deal with it later. And a year and a half later, it's still the same problem. Nobody is going to deal with this issue. And it's mind-boggling to me that people, because so many people have a problem with being seen as weak or wrong, and there are so many people who refused to admit that they're wrong, who will admit that they were defeated at any point. It's that sort of like blind arrogance or sort of blind. It's not my fault. Not my fault. And again, you don't understand, or you're not really paying attention to the things that are affecting you. It's just like what I was talking earlier about all of this accidental or intentional footage that gets uploaded that we all look at on our screens when we're scrolling. All of this stuff that flies by in the blink of an eye. We don't know how that's going to impact us mentally, emotionally, even physically. You don't know how you're being impacted on a moment-to-moment, day-to-day basis of all of this sort of unresolved, like, your word, trauma. It's just happening all the time. And it's like, how do we deal with that? And there's just so many of us dealing with it. It's crazy.
Yeah. Well, and then you got people who have studied this and say, well, this is how we need to address it. And then the people who they're telling that to don't want to listen.
No, of course not, because that's going to impact their, I don't know, stock market position or their profits or whatever. And we have so many people who are so focused on wealth that, what is the ideal in empathy? We can only feel empathy out to a certain degree, like 60 or 70 people beyond us. Beyond that, we really lose our capability to see other people as people. They just become numbers or objects. And we live in these huge, giant communities of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people pushed together. And we wonder why there's always a police siren or an ambulance siren or just all of this sort of
all the and people
it
needing
spills
help
out all the time.
Yeah. Well, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention, since we've been hitting on it, but the if anybody's listening to this and you guys do have any issues you're dealing with, you can actually dial 988 as a mental health crisis um, lifeline, and so they're there to help you. Do not be afraid to call, because there are people that do love you and want you around, and these people can help you. So 988 if you are dealing with anything like that, guys. And as we
again, that ties back into something that we talked about earlier, which is you never really know how you're going to impact somebody.
Yeah.
They always say that it was a smile that day from a complete stranger that turned everything around for me. And that's the kind of thing you sort of have to keep remembering. And I have to keep remembering, because there have been some very dark days for me over the last 2 years, after the last 20 years or whatever, where, you think, oh, it would be so much easier if I didn't have to deal with this, or whatever floats through your mind. And, you just have to try to remember that. And it sounds so cheesy. It sounds so cliche and trite to say that, things are going to get better, and things may not get better right now, but things change. Things do change. And if you're willing to take a step forward and then take a step forward after that, that change will get to you eventually. And I mean, there always has to be like this. I mean, we're separated by how many hundreds of miles right now? But we're talking, we're communicating. So
yeah, absolutely. And it hit me the other day. I have a friend that actually worked on the Legend of the White Dragon with JDF, and I reached out to him. I went to college with him and asked how he was doing, and we talked for like an hour. But of course, it was really early in the morning for me, so and he was going to bed. So we caught up later on too. But it really meant, he said, "Thank you so much for contacting me," and so yeah, it's just one of those things. If you think about somebody, shoot them a message and say hi, because right now I think that sometimes just doing that is sometimes all the first step in connection that we need.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really bad at that, and I think a lot of people are like me in the fact that I don't want to impose on anybody. I don't want to bother anybody. So, and because my problems, when I actually look at what my problems are, my quote unquote problems, they don't really compare to some other people in the world. And why on earth would I want to trouble somebody with my little sort of like niggling sort of doubts or fears or whatever it is? But you have to remember, whatever it is that you're going through is valid. Whatever it is that you're feeling, and if you're hurting, try not to do it on your own. That's kind of like, again, don't sweep it under the rug. Don't sweep it under the rug.
Yeah. Well, as my wife even says, she goes, it takes a village sometimes, and sometimes you need your village to help you. And and this kind of is a good way to get back to this, like with the writing and the catharsis, to work through a lot of that. What are some ways that you think, if people are looking at using writing as a way to kind of work through some of that mental anguish that they're dealing with,
Well, I think it's exactly what you did with the poetry and then the experimental filmmaking. It's when I started reading as a kid, when I had a book every day, I was reading all the time. I loved comic books. I loved Greek myths. I loved science fiction and fantasy. I gobbled up every fantasy novel I could. I played D&D, and these sort of like characters that would ride flying horses, and they had swords, and they would fight against big monsters and stuff. That I just ate that up every day. And then at some point I stopped reading it because I didn't see it wasn't being reflected in the real world. These stories of heroes that would get magic weapons to fight against big evil dark creatures or whatever, it all started to seem fake. It all started to seem like this is the wool that's being pulled over my eyes kind of stuff. And I started to read, I branched out and started reading other things and started to really sort of try to look at the world and look at it for what it is. And that's when, you start to get, I tweeted the other day that one of those things that needs to die is these cynical children's stories that they're turning into horror movies these days. The Winnie the Pooh as a slasher. So, it's that cynicism that you get as a grown adult when you see how uncaring the world can be. As far as, well, I don't care what's going on at home. You need to put in your 8 hours to work here today. That kind of thing. And so I think one of the reasons why I've been writing these stories of what I call horror stories or paranormal, supernatural kind of stuff, that's my way of fighting against the dark. That's my sort of link to the fantasy stuff that I was such a fan of, because, in my stories, I have to find a way to fight against the monsters myself. And the way to do that is to sort of well, I'll create these monsters and I know all about these monsters, and then I have somebody who's going to stand up against them, and I can get that. I can get behind that. And it's my way to sort of like, keep walking towards the light kind of thing. And so and what you were doing as far as like your poetry and experimental filmmaking, I think that's why we are spoiled these days with a glut of entertainment options. I don't know how many streaming services you have or how many movies you own, but when you look at like I buy films on the Vudu service, and when I scroll through that service to see what movies are available, or I scroll through Netflix, it's insane how many choices you have of 90-minute to 2-hour blocks of time that people have spent years or months of their time making. And how many of them are not good, how many of them are below par or mediocre, as opposed to those that receive the right amount of money or attention or marketing or whatever that we, and we are inundated every day with, here's the biggest, newest thing that's coming out, and everybody's got to go see Black Adam, everybody's got to go see Endgame, and it's just this sort of steamroller of here's something for you to distract yourself from the horribleness of the real world. Look at this, and it's just a never-ending glut of entertainment options, and at a certain point you just get frozen. You're like, I don't want to make a choice.
Because I'll sit here because I've got a new job in Columbia, Missouri at a TV station, and I'm having to stay at Airbnb temporarily until we can move up here. So I'm commuting, and I don't have a TV in my room at this Airbnb. So I've been bringing my iPad up, and I have to kind of go through and search these movies that I want to watch. And I sometimes find myself sitting there for 30 minutes just trying to find something that really piques my interest,
Right. And then I'll pick something that I've watched 100 times because it's just easier to do that.
So. Yeah. For me, my go-to is Lord of the Rings. I love those movies. And forgive me, I didn't mean to laugh earlier about the Winnie the Pooh thing, because every time I hear about that Winnie the Pooh horror movie, it makes me laugh a little bit, because I'm just like, that's all we had left to do.
I can remember when Five Nights at Freddy came out, the video game, which is sort of like this sort of horror take on Chuck E. Cheese, and I get that.
Yes.
And what was intriguing about that was it wasn't Chuck E. Cheese. It was this wholly new thing that they came up with, that whatever the developers did, they sort of like took the idea of Chuck E. Cheese and they put a little spin on it, and that's fine. It's just when you take these characters, like the latest one I saw was a Grinch movie where the Grinch becomes a serial killer, and Why? Why do we need
Yeah.
why do
Yeah.
we need the Peanuts characters to bash each other's heads in with a hammer in order for us to sort of like point and laugh and go, we're all in on the joke because we know it's cartoon characters? And it's like, come on.
Do you think it's reflective of just what we're all going through right now, and some people are just,
I
it's
think,
kind of
and it kind of ties into Power Rangers because all of the kids that watch that show growing up are not kids anymore.
Mhm.
They're in their 30s, getting close to their 40s, and the world's different. They're adults.
Yeah.
And I see all of these people who are like, I want a dark and gritty Power Rangers. Well, then it won't be Power Rangers.
Mhm.
And it's that sort of, we see the world, and Power Rangers doesn't reflect the real world, but we want to have the real world, and I think that's one of the reasons why the first couple of phases of the Marvel, the MCU movies worked really well, because they were able to find that sweet spot where those characters existed in a real world and they were believable. Oh, I get it. They're not just these comic book characters and whatever.
Mhm.
It's very believable that there's a guy out there that could make an iron suit that could fly and shoot rockets. I get
Yeah.
that. And it was done in such a really well done way and believable way that you're like, oh, that's very cool. But at the same time, it's why do we have to do that with everything? Why can't Winnie the Pooh just stay Winnie the Pooh?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people, these filmmakers, they, I always say to each their own cinema, because there's people out there that are gonna like, oh, I'm gonna gobble that up, but I'm just like, I love classic cinema more than anything, so you'll find me sometimes watching something from the 1940s rather than the new Transformers movie that's out,
It's
just
like,
because.
they made how many Sharknado movies, and
Yes,
now
Sharknado, man.
we have Cocaine Bear. I mean,
I just saw the trailer for that
it's
before we got on. I'm just like, oh my god.
I shake my head and I'm like going, I've spent 5 years trying to come up with some really interesting, well thought out stories,
Mm-hmm.
and nobody will ever see it because Cocaine Bear.
Well, I think cinema kind of does a circle as well at times. And like a lot of these movies, like Cocaine Bear, like to me, that is something that would have come out that Roger Corman would have produced in the 1970s for the
Well,
drive-in.
it reminded me of Lake Placid, where
Yeah.
you have this sort of monster alligator and stuff, and that was like very cool and unique, but I'm like going, why do I want to watch a show about a cocaine bear?
It's so like ridiculous. Like a lot of times people just go to see it because it's such a ridiculous name or idea.
What made me laugh is like, they've got some decent stars in it, and I'm like going, oh, okay.
Yeah, well, it's just like years ago when they made Cowboys versus Aliens. I went and watched that simply because I was like, okay, this is a 1950s sci-fi film with a huge budget and big cast members, but I knew what I was getting. I wasn't expecting an Academy Award-winning performance by anybody. It was just, this was just,
yeah, and
fun popcorn.
that's not to say that there are not diamonds in the rough. I mean, I watched Andor, and that is such an amazing story. It's an amazing.
I need to go watch it because everybody's telling me that I just have gotten off the Star Wars thing for the last few months.
There are a lot of people that don't like it because they feel that it's too slow. It has nothing to do with the Jedi. It has nothing to do with the Force. It has it doesn't have what people would think of as a Star Wars vibe to it, but it is so well done. It is so well filmed. It is the writing and the acting. It is a tense, edge of your seat, political thriller, and it's so good.
See, I loved Rogue One, and so I need to go.
Yeah.
I need to watch it. And there's some people that argue with me about Rogue One. I'm like, really? That put the war in Star Wars for me. I really liked it. It was definitely
my two favorite Star Wars movies are the original Star Wars before it was called The New Hope, and Rogue One. those two movies, those are I rank as my number one and number two, and then everything else after that, Empires comes three or whatever. But
oh yeah, Empire's magnificent.
right,
But I could write a dissertation about these last three films but I won't get into that. But
there's been so many words and so much print
yeah,
about all those things.
I know, man. I know. I remember. I'll tell you this. I was teaching a class one time at Missouri State. One of my students was asking me if I had seen The Last Jedi, and I said I had finally. And before I could even respond, this student started berating me like that I probably hated the whole thing of Luke Skywalker's too, and blah blah blah. And I said, honestly, that was not the number one thing on my list. And he was so shocked, and I was just like, here's my breakdown of it and story wise. And I was just like, basically with those movies, it comes down, they had the keys to the kingdom. They had no excuse not to map out those films, from beginning to end and have some coherency.
That's what I love about Kevin Feige and the MCU. They had everything mapped out before the first Iron Man movie hit the screen.
Yeah.
They knew where they were. It didn't matter, because at that point they were like, even if we're not going to be able to make any of the rest of this stuff, this is where it's going.
Yeah, exactly. They had a direction to go. Yeah. And then I heard J.J. Abrams and them were like, yeah, we just kind of want to do what George originally did, and we just wrote them as we went. And I'm like, that's the stupidest thing, because George...
The Force Awakens is nothing but A New Hope redone and reskinned. It's the same story.
Yep. Here's the thing I told you. It's a fan film. Every time I watch that movie, I'm like, it's a fan film, and I hated it more and more and more as I watched it.
I really enjoyed it because I really liked the character of Rey. I really liked the character of Finn, and I was like, okay, I can get behind these characters. And then the setup's nice, but then when you get towards the end, you start realizing what it's going on, and you're just like, man, really? We had to and then I heard stories about how Rian Johnson tore up the suggestions from J.J. Abrams, and he wrote his own, what became The Last Jedi. And, and this is how I sum up that trilogy. Somebody was asking me, and I said, in that scene in Lord of the Rings, the Two Towers, where Gandalf at the Helm's Deep, he rides up with the Riders of Rohan as the sun rises. I said, it's a great scene. I said, but what if he rode over that on a Harley with machine guns? And they were like, I'm like, it may look cool, but does it make sense? And I said, that's the last Star Wars trilogy for me. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, we still went down that path. I didn't mean to. Fine. I mean, it's any sort of franchise that big that has so many people who enjoy it, again, it's one of those things that was so easy for it to go off the rails. I mean, I know a lot of people that I have been friends with over the years and stuff. We didn't like the prequels. So, but then, I've met so many people that grew up with the prequels and think they're great. They're fantastic. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's great.
The only thing that I enjoyed in the prequels was Obi-Wan, and that was about it. But with Ewan McGregor, and I enjoyed that.
I like the Jedi before they became superheroes.
Yeah, and that makes sense too. That's very valid. I get that too. And it's just so interesting. But who was your favorite author growing up?
Stephen King.
Stephen King. Okay. All right. What was your
not because he was a horror author. I mean, Stephen King writes amazing characters. His he has an ability to pull you into these people's lives, and you live with these characters. It was awesome. So yeah.
Okay, what was your favorite story? That's like asking your favorite movie, I know. But
well, my favorite movie is easy, but my favorite story, gosh, Perseus, The Legend of Perseus. That's I think my favorite story, simply because depending on how you look at things, I mean, Perseus was the first hero. He performed the first heroic deeds or whatever. I guess that's the first one. And every heroic character after that is just sort of like the hero of a thousand faces. It's the same sort of tale. I mean, I was a big fan of the pulp stories, Tarzan, Doc Savage,
Yep.
the Spider, the Shadow.
Oh, I love the Shadow.
The Phantom, all of those characters I love.
Phantom's great. Yep.
I read all of Edgar Rice Burroughs' Tarzan novels. I read, the first 3 or 4 of the Princess of Mars stuff, John Carter. I read John Norman's Gore books, even though, looking back at them, you're like, oh, yeah, okay, well, not exactly the greatest thing in the world. And, and I adored Flash Gordon. Getting to meet Sam Jones at conventions is just mind blowing because Sam knows my name, and I'm like, holy shit, how did that happen? But I mean, we tell each other the same stories over and over. They just have different skins to them,
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the power of story because, you bring up Percy. So I like the story of the Golden Fleece. Jason and the Argonauts. That's something I would love to. I've always wanted to remake as my own, even as a web series at one point. But I'm in the middle of Missouri. I'm like, how in God's name can I pull that off? But unless I change the setting, But and I even love Macbeth. Shakespeare's Macbeth. And like the different, I'll watch any version that somebody makes of that just because it's so interesting to see. I still think I love the most recent one is Michael Fassbender's version, because they simply changed. They really didn't change the story. They just kind of changed how they shot it or told it because it didn't hit me till I watched that one. That
everybody in life, I think, goes through the same stuff that Macbeth goes through.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I don't care what sort of level of power you have. there's a moment when you think I could do better than that guy. And if I can get that guy out of the way, then I'll be in charge. And that's what that story is all about. It's about our own pride and hubris bringing about our fall. It's awesome.
Oh yeah, it's a great story. But they tell that same story in the Michael Fassbender one. But the one thing they it's like, I don't know if it was just the focus of how they shot it, but it hit me that Macbeth is dealing with PTSD in that, and that everything that we've been seeing, like the witches and stuff, it's all his imagination from his PTSD because he's going crazy, and that's why he was so easily manipulated by his wife because she was
again
have power. It's just.
It has to reflect the world that we live in now, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And it's crazy right now too with all the stuff, And I worked as a producer in the news, and just the stuff that I saw coming down the line, it was just like, good Lord, and I still see stuff happening, especially with Twitter now. I mean, I remember when the day after Elon took over, I refreshed my feed, and for like my entire feed for like 20 minutes was just full of so much vulgar, racist crap that people were retweeting. It was just like, really, guys? I mean, I don't care if you don't like the guy, but if you're just retweeting to retweet somebody else and to cause an issue, it's not helping anybody. You're just making everybody look bad. Yourself look bad, and you're just making it's just, what are we doing? And
the human animal and society has not evolved beyond where we were 2,500 years ago. We just have better toys and faster communication. We're still dealing with people who place themselves above others, or we place certain people on pedestals and they fail us all the time. And we're still struggling under a class system where the wealthy hold all the power, and it's just on an unprecedented scale at this point, where you have a supposed genius who proves constantly that he's not, and yet people will defend them. And it's, again, you don't understand the implications of how that's going to impact you until years down the road. How
Yeah.
all of us are going to deal with the fallout of
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
what's happening, what's been happening.
Well, and then you have people who are not hiding how they really feel by having dinners with some of the most racist white nationalist people around, and it's just like we're not even trying to hide things anymore, and then other politicians going and speaking at those people's rallies that they're hosting. And I'm like, guys, you gotta, and then you have the other part of the party going, hey, we don't like acting like they don't see anything, and they're not, you know, condemning it because they're afraid they're going to lose votes. And I'm like, I think at a point we need to kind of move past that and do what's right as human beings. And
I mean, there are people in the world who are working really hard to keep people outraged, to keep people off balance, and to not give them time to think. And that's the agenda. The agenda is keep people outraged, keep people from considering alternatives. And half of the people on Capitol Hill are not there to serve the public interest. They're there to gum up the works and to make sure that government doesn't work, so that they can yell and scream, "See, I told you, government doesn't work."
Yeah. It's all one big game, and I always kind of feel like we're all pawns in it, and then we're turned against each other on certain things and divided, and it's, I was listening to a really great podcast here recently called The Revolution, and it was about Newt Gingrich and when they came in and how they radicalized and changed things with the GOP, and hearing some of the Democrats back then and these other Republicans talking about how they respected each other so much, and like how we would debate each other, but then we would go out and have a beer afterwards because we had a respect for each other. And, even if we didn't agree with the other person's opinion, we respected them. Now you can't even have that. And I think that's the most telling sentence about where we're at right now. And it's
people, when you get into the political spectrum, people don't listen and people don't talk. It's, it's my side is the right side, and whatever you're doing over there, that's the wrong thing.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's also why you have people who are getting so much up in arms against people who are trying to be creative and trying to use creativity to bring to bring attention to issues that we're having, whether it's through art or writing or film or whatever.
Which makes me laugh whenever I see somebody who's like, "Why are you trying to make this political?" It's like every work of art, every piece of cinema, a book, whatever, it's all political.
Yeah. And my motto has always been this: art meets you where you're at in your life. Like, you and I could go stand in a museum and we could look at the same painting, and you and I are going to interpret that painting differently because we're at different points in our life. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And we could go back years later and look at that same painting, and it can mean something different to us, because that's what art does, and that's the beauty of it, whether it's a painting or a book or a film. And that's why I've become kind of a person, like, even though I may watch a film that's not my cup of tea, it's somebody else's, and it may mean something to them. And met them with what they're going through in life or whatever, and who knows, and even if it's
that's why you have people who want to ban books, because they don't want to get them to think about other things.
No, I know, and that's such a ridiculous man. Did you hear about the story that a lady, I forget where it was at, I want to say it was in Texas, and I'll have to find the story, but she followed the guidelines that were given to her by like the group that was kind of extreme Christian nationalist type of people or whoever it was, and she followed their guidelines, and she banned the Bible in the library, and they got mad about it, and she said it hits every single one of your guys' ticks here, and she went through and told every single story, and it held up.
Yep.
And it's kind of like, those people got mad, and I'm like, that's when you start
As far
to
as I'm
show
concerned,
the hypocrisy,
yeah, exactly. As far as I'm concerned, anybody who wants to ban a book is a hypocrite, because they have books that they want to push in your face, and that's the same type of thing. It's like, no, sorry.
No, I agree. And it's like when you see pastors online holding book burnings of stuff like Harry Potter and all that, and it's just like, what you're trying to make a point, but the point you're making is not what you think it is, and just be like, I've always been like this, because I had my first encounter with that when I did my first play in high school. I did one called The Hobbit, and the guy who was the technician in the town who did all the stuff at the theater, he wouldn't step foot in the theater while I was doing The Hobbit. And so we couldn't get him to fix anything. And I finally just confronted him nicely about it. I said, why are you acting this way about this? And he basically told me it was because there was a wizard in it. And I was like, really, that's why you're so upset. And I remember having a debate it was a friendly debate. I didn't get mad about it because I wanted to have understanding, and and that was fine. But he actually came in and fixed something for me, and before anybody got there for a practice, I remember. And that's when I talked to him. But I'll never forget that first experience of like, no, I'm not gonna do that, or step in there because you guys are doing this. And I'm thinking,
fear-based thinking, man. Fear-based.
It is. It's like the fear doctrine, as I call it. But anyway, so before we've been going for a while. We could keep going forever. I'm enjoying this, but let's circle back really quick and talk just real quick about your stories and where people can find them. Again, on Amazon and Barnes and Noble.
Yeah, I mean, if you search for my name and Lincoln Bright, you should be able to find them on Barnes and Noble and Amazon. There's a pinned tweet on my Twitter at David J. Fielding that leads to the second of the Lincoln Bright novels, where you can find the other ones there too. The third book, Gifts, should be out sometime in January, and I'm trying to get myself into a place where I can start working on book 4 so I can wrap it all up.
Awesome, that's great, man. Well, I'm glad you're still, even with everything that's going on, that you're keeping creative and getting back out there, and and taking the time to sit here and talk to me for almost 80 minutes.
Not a problem.
And because we covered a lot of different things today that I didn't even have on my list or outline, but that's what good conversation does. And again, if anybody's out there and you're trying to work through something and you can't, call 988. But also, don't be afraid to pick up a paintbrush. Don't be afraid to start typing, or writing or journaling. Because you might just end up.
That's the thing. I think that the message is like, you need to give part of yourself to the world, because you don't know what the world's going to give back.
I think that's the most beautiful way to end this episode, is with that.
Yeah,
that is perfect. David, thank you for being on here, and I really appreciate you.
You got it.
If you ever need anything, you too, man. If you ever need anything, give me a call.
Will do.
All right, guys. Thanks for listening. This has been Voided Transmissions.